Get on your knees, ma'am, now. The command cut through the quiet like something heavier than sound, something that made the air itself stiffen, and for a second, even the wind seemed to hesitate across the trimmed suburban lawn. Naomi Carter didn't move right away. Barefoot on cool grass still damp from the early morning sprinkler cycle, she stood with her shoulders relaxed, her hands visible at her sides, her breathing steady, as if the voice behind her belonged to a distant memory rather than the man standing 10 feet away with authority in his tone and impatience in his stance. The click of a radio hissed at his shoulder. A car door slammed somewhere down the street. Curtains shifted, just slightly, and the houses lined up like silent witnesses. I said on your knees. Officer Daniel Reeves repeated, sharper this time. Stepping closer, the gravel under his boots crunching with each step, controlled but loud enough to make a point. It too, his jaw tightening for just a fraction of a second before his posture straightened even more, his tone flattening into something practiced. Ma'am, last warning. The distance between them closed. The morning sun caught on the metal of the handcuffs as he pulled them free, the polished surface flashing briefly like a signal no one answered. Naomi looked down at the cuffs, then back up, not at his face, but just past it, as if she were measuring something beyond him, something larger than the moment. Turn your body cam on, she said quietly. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even a challenge. It was an observation wrapped in a sentence. Reeves hesitated, just for a heartbeat, the kind of pause that would be invisible if you weren't looking for it, then shook his head slightly, as if dismissing his own doubt. Hands behind your back. The neighborhood held its breath. Naomi slowly brought her hands together behind her, the movement deliberate, controlled, not rushed, not resistant. The metal closed around her wrists with a firm, final click, tight enough to leave a mark, not enough to justify complaint. The boy's phone tilted, adjusting, zooming in. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then stopped. Naomi lowered her gaze for a brief moment, not in defeat, not in fear, but in something closer to patience. Then she lifted her head again, eyes steady, voice soft enough that it barely carried beyond the space between them. You don't know who you're humiliating, she said, the words landing without force, without anger, but with a certainty that lingered in the air long after they were spoken. But you will. The cuffs settled cold against Naomi's skin, not painful, just present, a quiet weight that made itself known with every subtle shift of her wrists. And for a moment no one spoke, not the officer, not the neighbors, not even the boy with the phone whose small fingers tightened slightly around the device, as if he sensed something unfolding that he did not yet understand. The morning light climbed a little higher, reflecting off the patrol car parked at the curb, its engine still running, a low hum blending with the faint buzz of distant lawn equipment somewhere down the block, ordinary sounds continuing as if nothing had changed while everything had. Officer Reeves took a step back, adjusting his stance, scanning the street with the practiced motion of someone who believed control came from visibility, from being seen doing the right thing, even when the definition of right had already begun to slip beneath him. You are being detained until we verify your identity, he said, his voice steadier now, more formal, as if the structure of the sentence itself could reinforce the authority he felt beginning to thin. Naomi did not respond immediately, her gaze drifting briefly toward the boy again, the faint tremble in his hands more noticeable now that the moment had stretched, and for the first time there was something softer in her eyes, not fear, not anger, but recognition, as if she understood exactly what it meant to be watching something you could not yet name. Keep recording, she said gently, not looking directly at him this time. Just, street, slowing just slightly before continuing on, the driver's head turning in a brief, curious glance that lingered a fraction too long. Somewhere a screen door creaked open, then shut again. The world was paying attention now, in small, fragmented ways. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, the grass bending under her feet, the faint imprint of her stance already visible, and she lifted her chin just enough to meet his eyes fully for the first time since the cuffs had closed. There was no challenge in the look, no attempt to intimidate, just a steady presence that did not match the role he had assigned her. You received a call, she said, each word measured, about a trespasser, and you arrived without confirming ownership, without announcing properly, and without recording the interaction. Reeves blinked, the cadence of her voice catching him off guard, the structure of her words more precise than he expected, more controlled than the situation seemed to warrant. "Ma'am, I do not need a lecture," he interrupted. But the interruption came a beat too late, as if he had realized halfway through that he needed to reassert something and was not entirely sure what. Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the interruption without yielding to it. "You are right," she said. "You do not need a lecture." And for a brief second there was silence again, a deeper one this time, heavier, stretching just long enough to make the next words feel inevitable. "You need a record." The boy's phone steadied, his breathing audible now in the quiet space between voices, and somewhere behind Reeves, the faint crackle of his radio shifted into a clearer signal, a voice beginning to form through static, calling out a unit number that matched the one printed on the side of his patrol car. Reeves turned his head slightly, distracted, his attention splitting between the radio, the camera, and the woman standing in front of him who refused to react the way he expected. Naomi remained still, the cuffs unmoving, her expression unchanged, but there was something different in the air now, something subtle but undeniable, like the moment just before a storm changes direction. The boy adjusted his grip again, zooming in just enough to capture the details, the line of Naomi's jaw, the slight tension in Reeves's shoulders, the glint of metal at her wrists, and the quiet, unshaken calm that did not belong in a scene like this, but refused to leave. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, Reeves said into his shoulder, his voice tightening just slightly as he pressed the button. "I need confirmation on the property owner at this address." And as he spoke, Naomi closed her eyes for the briefest moment, not in resignation, not in relief, but in something closer to patience finally being acknowledged. And when she opened them again, the stillness returned, deeper now, anchored, as if whatever came next had already been decided long before he arrived. The radio crackled louder this time, the static clearing just enough to let a voice push through, clipped and procedural. "Unit 12, stand by for confirmation." And the words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, stretching the moment into something heavier, something that made even the smallest movements feel deliberate. Officer Reeves lowered his hand slowly from the radio, his fingers brushing the edge of his vest, as if grounding himself, his eyes shifting briefly toward Naomi and then away again, like he was not ready to fully meet what stood in front of him. Naomi did not move, her wrists still held behind her back, the faint tension in her shoulders the only sign that the metal had any presence at all, and yet her posture remained upright, composed, as if she had stood in far more difficult places than a quiet suburban lawn under a watchful sky. The boy's phone captured everything, the slight tilt of Reeves's head, the way his stance had lost just a fraction of its earlier certainty, the way the morning light now seemed harsher, more revealing, reflecting off the patrol car's windshield in a sharp glare that forced him to squint. "Dispatch." The voice returned, clearer now, more certain. "Property records show the residence is registered to Naomi Carter." And there was a pause, just long enough for the name to settle into the space between them. Repeat, registered to Naomi Carter. And something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone. Reeves blinked once, then again, his jaw tightening slightly, as if the confirmation had not landed the way he expected, as if he were waiting for an additional line that would correct it, clarify it, reshape it into something that fit the version of the situation he had already committed to. "Copy," he said finally, but the word came out thinner, less anchored, and he cleared his throat quietly, adjusting his stance again, his boots pressing deeper into the gravel as if seeking stability where there was none. Naomi lifted her chin a fraction higher, not in triumph, not in accusation, just enough to acknowledge that the truth had entered the conversation, and for a brief moment her eyes softened, not toward him, but toward the space itself, as if she had seen this exact moment play out in 100 different forms before. "You have your confirmation," she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying without force, and the simplicity of the sentence made it harder to ignore, harder to deflect. Reeves inhaled slowly, his gaze flicking toward the boy again, toward the phone still held up, still recording, the small red light blinking like a silent witness that refused to look away, and then toward the houses, the barely parted curtains, the outlines of neighbors who had stepped closer to their windows, drawn in by the stillness that had replaced the initial urgency. "Ma'am," he began, the word catching slightly before he continued. "If there has been a misunderstanding." But the sentence did not finish, not fully, because even as he spoke, another voice cut through the radio, sharper this time, more direct. Unit 12, additional note on file. Subject Naomi Carter is flagged under federal registry, high clearance designation, and the air seemed to tighten again, this time not with tension, but with realization beginning to take shape. Reeves froze for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering again near the radio, his eyes narrowing as if trying to process the words, to place them, to understand how they connected to the woman standing in front of him with quiet patience and restrained stillness. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, a slow inhale passing through her, and when she opened them again, there was no change in her expression, no shift in her posture, only the same grounded presence that had been there from the beginning. "Officer," she said, her tone unchanged, but now carrying a weight that was harder to ignore. "I am going to ask you again," and she paused, just long enough for him to meet her eyes. Fully this time, without looking away, "Remove the cuffs." And the words settled into the space between them with a finality that did not require repetition. Reeves swallowed, the movement subtle but visible, his fingers finally reaching toward the metal at her wrists, hesitating for a fraction of a second before making contact. And in that hesitation, in that brief pause where authority met truth and did not immediately know how to respond, the entire scene seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what came next. The metal did not open right away. Officer Reeves's fingers rested against the cuffs as if they had forgotten their purpose, as if the simple act of unlocking them now carried more weight than placing them there in the first place. And for a brief second his hand hovered, caught between procedure and something quieter, something harder to name. Naomi did not pull away, did not shift. She simply waited, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady on him, not pressing, not pleading, just present in a way that made the silence stretch. "Sir," the radio voice returned, sharper now, more insistent. "That designation requires immediate de-escalation and full documentation of the encounter." And the words seemed to land directly between them, closing the space that hesitation had created. Reeves inhaled, a deeper breath this time, and the tension in his shoulders dropped just slightly, as if something inside him had finally given way, and with a small, controlled movement, he turned the key. The click this time sounded different, softer, almost swallowed by the stillness around them, and the cuffs loosened, the pressure releasing without drama, without resistance. Naomi brought her hands forward slowly, rubbing one wrist with the other. In a small, absent motion, not exaggerating the mark, not drawing attention to it, just acknowledging it as something that had happened and was now over. The boy's phone adjusted again, zooming in, capturing the shift, the release, the subtle change in the air that came with it. Reeves stepped back half a pace, his hands now empty, uncertain for the first time since he had arrived, and he cleared his throat quietly. "Ma'am, he began, but the word stalled, caught somewhere between explanation and apology, and neither seemed to fit cleanly anymore. Naomi lowered her hands, letting them rest at her sides again, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing unchanged, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm it had from the beginning. But now there was something else beneath it, something firmer, more defined. "You made an assumption," she said, not accusatory, not raised, just stated. And the simplicity of it made it harder to deflect. "And then you acted on it without verifying the facts." Reeves nodded once, a small, automatic motion, his eyes dropping briefly to the ground before lifting again. "I responded to a call," he said. But even as he spoke, the sentence sounded thinner, less complete, as if he could hear the gaps in it himself. Naomi tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to its sufficiency. "You responded," she said, "but you did not observe." And the distinction settled between them like a line that could not be crossed back over. Somewhere behind them, a car door opened, then closed, footsteps approaching on the sidewalk, measured, purposeful, and both of them turned slightly toward the sound. A man in a pressed uniform, older, composed, moved toward them with quiet urgency, his eyes taking in the scene in a single sweep, The patrol car, the gathered attention, the phone still raised in the boy's hands, and finally Naomi. He stopped a few feet away, his posture straightening further as recognition set in, and without hesitation, he lifted his hand in a precise, respectful gesture. "Ma'am," he said, his tone controlled but unmistakably formal. "General Carter," and the title settled into the space with a clarity that no radio transmission could match. Reeves stiffened beside him, the word landing heavier than anything that had come before, his gaze shifting quickly from the man to Naomi, then back again, as if confirming what he had just heard. Naomi inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. Nothing more, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. The man lowered his hand and turned briefly toward Reeves, his voice dropping just enough to keep it contained but not enough to hide the weight of it. "We will need a full report," he said, and Reeves nodded again, this time more firmly, though the motion carried none of the earlier confidence, only compliance. The boy's phone captured everything, the shift in posture, the recognition, the subtle unraveling of certainty, and the quiet way authority had changed shape in the span of a few minutes. Naomi looked once more at Reeves, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something quieter, something closer to expectation, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them again. "Next time," she said, her voice low, even, "lead with clarity, not assumption." And then she turned, stepping across the grass toward the house behind her, her bare feet leaving faint impressions in the damp ground that would fade within minutes, as if the moment itself would try to disappear, but the stillness she left behind lingered, settling into the space where authority had been questioned and quietly redefined. The front door opened with a soft click just as Naomi reached the first step, the sound barely louder than the breeze brushing against the hedges, and she paused for a fraction of a second before stepping inside, not hurried, not hesitant, simply continuing forward as if the moment outside had already been placed exactly where it belonged. Behind her, the street remained still, but not empty, the kind of stillness that carried attention rather than silence. And Officer Reeves stood where she had left him, his hands now resting at his sides, the absence of the cuffs more noticeable than their presence had been minutes earlier. The older officer beside him spoke quietly, his words measured, procedural, but firm enough to anchor the situation, and Reeves nodded again, slower this time, as if each acknowledgement required more effort than the last. Across the street, the boy lowered his phone slightly, his arms beginning to tire, but his eyes stayed fixed on the doorway Naomi had just passed through, as if expecting something else, something unfinished, and for a moment he looked down at the screen, watching the replay flicker across it in real time, the small red icon still blinking, still recording. "Marcus," the woman behind him said softly, stepping closer, placing a hand on his shoulder, but he did not move right away, his gaze lifting again toward the house, his expression no longer just curious, but thoughtful, as if something had shifted in the way he saw the world, something subtle but permanent. Officer Reeves turned slightly toward his patrol car, then stopped, his hand brushing against the door handle without opening it, his reflection staring back at him in the glass, distorted by the angle, unfamiliar in a way that made him pause. The radio at his shoulder crackled again, another unit checking in, another voice asking for status, routine continuing as if the last few minutes could be filed away and reduced to a line in a report, but the weight of it did not move that easily. "Unit 12, confirmed situation resolved," the voice said, and Reeves pressed the button, his thumb steady but slower than before. "Situation is resolved," he replied, the words accurate but incomplete, lacking the part that could not be transmitted over a channel, the part that stayed with him even after the sentence ended. The older officer watched him for a moment, then nodded once, a subtle gesture that carried both acknowledgement and expectation, and turned back toward his vehicle, leaving Reeves alone again with the quiet that had settled over the street. The patrol car's engine continued its low hum, steady, unchanged, but everything else felt different, the air cooler, the light sharper, the edges of things more defined. Reeves finally opened the door, then stopped again, his hand still on the handle, and glanced once more toward the house, toward the closed door, toward the space where Naomi had stood, and for the first time since arriving, he allowed the moment to replay fully, not as a sequence of actions, but as a series of choices, each one clearer now than it had been when he made it. Inside the house, Naomi moved through the entryway with the same measured calm, her steps quiet against the hardwood floor, the faint scent of polished wood and morning coffee lingering in the air, familiar, grounding. And she set her keys down on a small table by the door, the soft clink echoing briefly in the otherwise silent space. She paused there, just for a second, her hand resting lightly on the surface, her gaze unfocused, not on anything in particular, but on the space between moments, the place where everything settled. Then she exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, and continued deeper into the house, leaving the door behind her, leaving the scene outside exactly where it had ended. Back on the street, Marcus lowered his phone completely this time, in a boy's hands, and in the silence that followed a mistake finally seen for what it was. The engine finally turned over with a low, controlled rumble, but Officer Reeves did not pull away immediately, his hands still resting on the steering wheel, fingers tightening slightly, as if testing the reality of something that no longer felt as solid as it had minutes before. And outside the windshield the street looked unchanged, the same row of houses, the same trimmed lawns, the same quiet order that had existed before he arrived. Yet the stillness now carried a different weight, something quieter but harder to ignore. He shifted in his seat, glancing once more toward the house, the white door closed, the windows reflecting the morning light, nothing outwardly different, and yet he knew that what had just happened would not stay confined behind that door, not anymore. His radio crackled again, a routine dispatch tone. Unit 12, confirm you are clear to return to patrol. And for a second, he did not answer, his thumb hovering over the button as if the act of responding would finalize something he was not ready to close. Across the street, Marcus stood with his phone lowered now, his shoulders slightly slumped from holding it so long, but his attention still fixed on the patrol car, on the officer inside it, as if he were waiting for something else to happen. Something that would explain what he had just seen. Yes, Reeves finally said into the radio, his voice steady but quieter. Unit 12 is clear, and the words felt automatic, procedural, even as the meaning behind them felt incomplete. He eased the car into motion, the tires rolling slowly over the pavement, and as he passed Marcus, their eyes met for a brief second, the kind of moment that lasted longer than it should. The boys gazed direct, unfiltered, not accusatory, not afraid, just observant, and Reeves looked away first, focusing back on the road ahead. The car turned at the end of the block, disappearing from view, but the space it left behind did not return to normal. Right away, the silence lingering, stretching, as if the street itself needed time to settle. Marcus looked down at his phone again, his thumb hovering over the screen, replaying the video once more, the sound of the cuffs clicking, the voice, the stillness, and he swallowed, a small, quiet reaction that carried more understanding than he could have explained. We should go inside, his mother said gently, her hand still resting on his shoulder, and this time he nodded, but before turning away, he tapped the screen once, then again, uploading. The small progress circle beginning to move, slow at first, then steady, carrying the moment beyond the street, beyond the houses, into a space where it would not fade so easily. Inside her home, Naomi moved into the kitchen, the familiar layout grounding her steps, the sunlight filtering through the blinds in narrow bands across the counter, and she reached for a glass, filling it with water, the sound steady, controlled, a simple action that carried a quiet sense of normalcy. She leaned lightly against the counter, taking a slow sip, her gaze drifting toward the window, not to watch, but to feel the shift, the difference in the air, the way the morning had changed without altering its appearance. Her phone rested on the counter beside her, silent for a moment longer, then vibrating softly. Once, twice, the screen lighting up with a notification she did not immediately pick up. Across town, the patrol car merged into traffic, the flow of vehicles steady, predictable, and Reeves kept his eyes forward, his posture rigid, as if holding himself in place could prevent his thoughts from moving too far ahead. But they did anyway, replaying the sequence, not as a blur, but as individual moments, each one clearer now, each decision more defined, and he exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it entered. The radio remained quiet, But the silence was not empty. It carried the weight of what would come next. Reports, reviews, questions, things that would not be resolved with a single statement or a routine confirmation. Back in the quiet neighborhood, the upload completed, the small notification flashing briefly on Marcus's screen before disappearing, and he slipped the phone into his pocket, unaware of how far it would travel, how many eyes would see what he had seen, how many would pause at the same moment, the same stillness, the same shift. Inside the house, Naomi finally picked up her phone, glancing at the screen, her expression unchanged as the notifications began to stack, one after another, names, numbers, unfamiliar accounts, all pointing to the same thing, the same moment now moving beyond her control, and she set the phone back down without opening any of them, her hand resting beside it for a brief second before she straightened, her shoulders steady, her breathing even. Outside, the sunlight continued to rise, casting longer shadows across the lawns, the impressions in the grass already fading, the physical traces of the moment disappearing as if nothing had happened, but the quiet remained, carrying something unseen, something that would not fade with the light, something already moving beyond the edges of the street, into a space where it would be seen, replayed, and understood in ways that could not be undone. The notifications did not stop, they multiplied, each vibration against the kitchen counter sharper than the last, stacking into a quiet rhythm that filled the room without making a sound. And Naomi stood there for a moment longer, her hand resting near the phone but not touching it, her gaze steady, as if she were listening to something beneath the surface of it all, something deeper than the alerts themselves. Outside, the neighborhood had begun to move again, cars passing, doors opening, the ordinary returning in small pieces, but the shift remained, subtle and persistent, carried in the way people glanced a second longer than usual, in the way conversations paused before continuing. Across town, Officer Reeves pulled into the precinct parking lot, the tires rolling over the painted lines before coming to a stop, and for a second he remained in the driver's seat, engine idling. The same hesitation from earlier settling over him again, heavier now, harder to ignore. His phone, mounted near the dashboard, lit up with a notification, then another, and he frowned slightly, reaching for it with a slow, uncertain motion, his thumb hovering before tapping the screen. The video opened. Instantly, the image clear, stable, framed in a way that left no room for interpretation, and he watched himself step forward, heard his own voice, felt the moment replay not from memory, but from outside himself, stripped of context, reduced to action and tone. His jaw tightened as the clip continued, the silence in the car pressing in, and when the moment came, the click of the cuffs, the stillness that followed. He exhaled sharply, looking away before the end, but the reflection remained, lingering even after the screen dimmed. Reeves, a voice called from across the lot, pulling him back, and he stepped out of the car, the door closing with a muted thud, his posture straightening automatically as he turned toward the building. But the weight in his chest did not lift with the motion. Inside, the precinct buzzed with its usual energy, phones ringing, voices overlapping, papers moving from desk to desk. But as he walked in, something shifted, small at first, a glance here, a pause there, the subtle change in tone that comes when a story arrives before the person does. One officer near the front desk looked up, then down again quickly. Another turned slightly, lowering his voice mid-sentence, and Reeves felt it, not openly, not spoken, but present in the space around him. His phone vibrated again in his hand, another notification, another share, another view, and he slipped it into his pocket without checking, the screen still warm against his palm. Back in the house, Naomi finally picked up her phone, her fingers moving with quiet precision as she unlocked it, the screen filling with alerts, messages from unknown numbers, official contacts, media inquiries, all converging on the same moment. The same clip now spreading faster than it could be contained. She opened the video, not from curiosity, but from recognition, watching it once, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and when it ended, she did not replay it. She simply set the phone down. Again, her hand lingering on the edge of the counter for a brief second. The sunlight had shifted slightly, casting new angles across the room, the lines sharper now, the shadows more defined, and she moved toward The window, looking out not at the street, but through it, beyond it, as if measuring the distance between what had happened and what would follow. In the precinct, Reeves stepped into a smaller office, the door closing behind him with a soft click, and the noise outside dulled immediately, leaving him alone with the quiet hum of the overhead light and the weight of the moment that had followed him inside. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk, his gaze fixed on the surface, as if expecting it to offer something solid, something certain, but it remained still, unchanged. His radio, now clipped at his side, crackled faintly with distant voices, routine continuing without him, and he closed his eyes for a brief second, not in exhaustion, not in avoidance, but in acknowledgement, a silent recognition that what had begun as a simple call had shifted into something larger, something that would not be resolved with a report or a statement. Outside, the video continued to move from one screen to another, each view adding weight, each share expanding the moment, carrying it into spaces where it would be seen, questioned, and understood in ways that extended far beyond the quiet street where it began. And in that movement, in that quiet spread, the balance of the moment continued to change, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, with a force that did not need to announce itself to be felt. The room did not change, but the air inside it felt different, as if something invisible had shifted position and settled in a place it could not be ignored. And Naomi stood by the window a moment longer, her reflection faint against the glass, the lines of her face steady, composed, untouched by the noise building beyond the walls. Her phone vibrated again behind her, a soft, persistent rhythm that no longer demanded attention but carried its own kind of gravity. And when she finally turned back toward the counter, she did not rush, did not react. She simply reached for it and picked it up with the same measured control she had carried through the entire morning. The screen lit her face briefly, a cascade of messages, missed calls, names layered over numbers. Some familiar, most not, all pointing to the same thing, the same moment now unfolding in places she could not see. She opened one message, then another, not reading fully, just scanning, acknowledging, and then she paused on a notification from a name she recognized immediately, a senior command contact, the kind that did not call without reason. She tapped it, bringing the phone to her ear, her posture straightening just slightly, not out of tension, but out of habit. General Carter, the voice on the other end said, calm but firm, carrying the weight of authority without raising itself. We are aware of the situation. And Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second, not in relief, not in concern, but in recognition that the moment had moved beyond the street entirely. Yes, sir, she replied, her tone even, controlled. I assumed as much, and there was a pause on the line, a short one, filled not with uncertainty but with calculation, as if decisions were already being made. Somewhere beyond both of them. Do you require assistance? The voice asked, and Naomi glanced toward the window again. The street outside quiet, the surface calm. No, sir, she said after a beat. Everything that needed to happen has already happened, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any explanation could have. Across town, the office door opened without warning, and Reeves straightened instinctively, turning as a senior officer stepped in, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp, already aware, already informed. We need to talk, the man said, his tone low, controlled, and Reeves nodded once, the motion automatic, though the weight behind it had shifted. The video played again on a screen in the corner of the room, not his phone this time, but larger, clearer, the details sharper, the angles unforgiving, and Reeves could not look away from it now, not when it was placed directly in front of him, not when it no longer belonged to him alone. The sound was low, but the silence between the words carried through, the moment stretching, the choices visible in a way they had not been when he made them. Walk me through it, the senior officer said, and Reeves inhaled slowly, his hands resting on the desk, grounding himself in the present even as the past replayed in front of him. Back in the house, Naomi ended the call with a quiet tap, setting the phone down once more, and this time it did not vibrate immediately, the silence returning. But it was not empty. It was full, carrying everything that had already begun to unfold. She moved toward the sink, rinsing the glass she had used earlier, the water running steadily, the sound simple, controlled. And for a moment, it was the only thing she focused on, the only thing that existed in that space. Outside, the light had shifted again, brighter now, the shadows shorter, the day continuing forward without pause, without acknowledgement of what had passed. But the movement beyond the street told a different story, one that was still forming, still spreading. Marcus sat at the kitchen table across the street, his phone in front of him now. The video open, the view count climbing steadily, numbers rising in a way he did not fully understand but could feel, each increase marking something larger than he could name. He looked up at his mother, his expression thoughtful. "Is he in trouble?" he asked quietly, and she hesitated, not because she did not have an answer, but because the answer was not simple, not immediate. "He will have to answer for it," she said finally, and Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the screen, watching the moment again, the stillness, the shift, the change that had begun with something small and moved into something much larger. In the precinct, Reeves began to speak, his voice steady at first, then more deliberate, each word chosen carefully, not to defend, not to justify, but to recount, and as he did, the space around him seemed to tighten, not with pressure, but with clarity, the kind that leaves no room for assumption, no space for misinterpretation. Outside, the world continued, traffic moving, voices rising and falling, but beneath it all, the moment remained, carried forward, not loud, not chaotic, but steady, shaping what would come next in ways that could not be undone. The words did not echo, but they stayed, suspended in the room. As Officer Reeves finished speaking, his voice settling into the silence like something that had finally found its place, and the senior officer across from him did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the screen where the video had already looped again, the moment repeating without distortion, without omission, every second preserved with a clarity that left no space for interpretation. Reeves stood still, his hands no longer gripping the desk, but resting lightly against it, his shoulders squared out of habit, not confidence. And for the first time since the morning began, there was nothing left to say that would change what had already been seen. The senior officer reached forward and paused the video at a single frame, the image frozen on Naomi standing still, her posture composed, her gaze steady, the cuffs visible but no longer the focus, and he tapped the screen once with his finger, not forcefully, just enough to mark the moment. "Right here," he said quietly, his voice controlled, measured. "This is where you had the chance to reassess." And Reeves followed his gaze, looking at the frame, not defensively, not avoiding it, but fully, as if seeing it for the first time in a way that mattered. "Yes, sir," he replied, the words simple, unguarded, and there was no attempt to explain beyond that, no addition, no qualification, just acknowledgement. The senior officer nodded once, not in approval, not in dismissal, but in recognition of something that had shifted, something that did not erase the action but clarified it, and he leaned back slightly, the chair creaking softly under the movement. "This is already outside our control," he continued, gesturing faintly toward the screen, toward the phone resting beside it where notifications continued to appear, each one marking another share, another view, another pair of eyes. Reeves did not look at the phone, he kept his focus forward, his posture steady, as if bracing himself for what came next. "There will be a review," the senior officer said, "and there will be consequences." And the words were not delivered as a threat, not as punishment, but as a continuation of something that had already begun. Something inevitable. Reeves nodded again, slower this time, the motion carrying weight, not resistance, and he exhaled quietly, the breath leaving him steadier than before, as if accepting the shape of what had already formed. Back at the house, Naomi sat at the small table near the window, her phone now resting face down in front of her, the screen still lighting intermittently with incoming messages. But she did not reach for it again, not immediately, her attention instead focused on the stillness around her, the quiet that had returned inside the walls even as the outside world continued to move. She folded her hands loosely on the table, her fingers still, her posture upright but relaxed, and for a moment she allowed herself to sit in the space between action and response, the place where decisions are made not out of urgency, but out of clarity. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking time in a way that felt more deliberate now, each second distinct, separate, and she glanced at it briefly before looking back toward the window. The light now higher, brighter, the day fully underway. Across the street, Marcus refreshed the screen again, the numbers climbing faster now, comments appearing beneath the video, words from people he did not know, places he had never seen, all reacting to the same moment he had captured without fully understanding what it would become. He read a few of them, his brow tightening slightly, not in confusion, but in concentration, as if trying to piece together something larger than the clip itself. "Mom," he said again, quieter this time. "They are all watching." And she nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Yes," she said, "they are." And there was no alarm in her voice, no urgency, just a calm recognition of what that meant. In the precinct, the room remained still after the conversation ended. The video paused, the screen dimming slightly as the system idled. And Reeves stepped back from the desk, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if each step now carried intention rather than habit. He glanced once more at the frozen frame, at the moment captured there, and then turned away, not to escape it, but to move forward with it. The weight no longer something he could set down, but something he would have to carry. Outside, the day continued without pause. Cars moving, voices rising, the ordinary unfolding in its usual rhythm. But beneath it all, the moment remained, not as noise, not as chaos, but as a quiet shift, something that had already begun to change the direction of things, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, with a clarity that did not need to announce itself to be understood. The hallway outside the office felt longer than it had when he walked in, the fluorescent lights above casting a steady, indifferent glow that flattened everything beneath it. And Officer Reeves stepped into that light without hesitation, but not without weight, the door closing quietly behind him as if sealing the conversation inside. The sounds of the precinct returned in layers, phones ringing, keyboards tapping, voices overlapping in low, constant motion, but beneath it all there was a shift, subtle but present, the kind that moved through a room before words were spoken. A screen mounted near the front desk flickered with a news feed, the same video now framed with headlines, captions forming narratives in real time. And as Reeves passed, he did not look up at first, his gaze fixed forward, his pace measured, but the reflection in the polished floor caught the movement, the flash of his own image beside the clip, and he slowed just enough for the connection to register. The anchor's voice was low but clear, filtered through the ambient noise. Incident under review, identity confirmed as General Naomi Carter, and the name carried differently now, no longer a private realization, but a public fact, repeated, shared, amplified. Reeves stopped walking, not fully, just enough to turn his head slightly toward the screen, his eyes settling on the frame where Naomi stood still, composed, unchanged by the labels placed around her, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow, the noise fading into the background as the image held him there. "You should go upstairs," a voice said quietly beside him, and he turned to see another officer, not confrontational, not sympathetic, just direct. Acknowledging the moment without expanding on it, Reeves nodded once, the motion small but firm, and turned toward the stairwell, each step upward slower than the last, not from hesitation, but from the awareness that each level brought him closer to something that would not be as contained, not as procedural. Upstairs, the atmosphere shifted again, quieter, more controlled, the conversations fewer, the movements more deliberate, and he approached a closed door at the end of the hall, pausing for a fraction of a second before knocking. The response came immediately, "Come in," and he opened the door, stepping into a room that felt still in a different way, the kind of stillness that held authority rather than absence. Behind the desk, a senior official looked up, his expression neutral, his posture composed, and on the screen beside him, the video played again, muted this time, the visuals alone carrying the weight. "Sit," the man said, and Reeves did, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, grounded, present. The video continued in silence, looping once more, and when it ended, the official did not speak right away, allowing the stillness to settle fully before leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "You understand the scope of this," he said, not as a question, but as a statement that required acknowledgement, and Reeves met his gaze directly. "Yes, sir," he replied. The words steady, without defense, without hesitation. The official nodded. Once, his eyes shifting briefly toward the screen, then back again. "This is no longer about a single decision," he continued, his tone even, measured. "It is about what that decision represents," and the distinction settled into the room with quiet clarity. Across town, Naomi stood in her study now, the space lined with framed photographs, commendations, moments captured from a life lived in service. And she moved past them without pause, not needing to look, not needing to revisit, her focus. Forward, grounded in the present. Her phone rested on the desk, the notifications still arriving, but now interspersed with official requests, statements, inquiries that carried structure rather than noise. And she picked it up once more, scanning briefly before setting it down again, her expression unchanged. She stepped toward the window, looking out at the street, the same calm surface, the same quiet order, and for a moment she simply stood there, not reacting, not anticipating, just observing. Back in the office, Reeves exhaled slowly, the breath measured, and for the first time since the conversation began, the weight felt defined, not lighter, but clearer, shaped by the words that had been spoken. The official leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. "There will be a formal process," he said, "and you will be part of it." And Reeves nodded, the motion deliberate, accepting not just the outcome, but the path that led to it. Outside, the city continued to move, unaware of the specific room, the specific conversation, but already shaped by the moment that had left that quiet street and entered a wider space. One where it would be examined, understood, and remembered, not as noise, but as something that had shifted the balance, quietly, steadily, in a way that could not be reversed. The room remained quiet after the words settled, not empty but full, the kind of silence that did not need to be filled because everything that mattered had already been placed in it. And Officer Reeves sat there for a moment longer, his posture unchanged, his hands steady against his knees, as if holding himself in place allowed him to fully understand the shape of what was happening. The official across from him did not rush, did not press, he simply observed, giving the moment the space it required. And when he finally spoke again, his tone carried the same measured calm. "What you choose next matters more than what already happened." And the sentence landed with quiet precision, not offering relief, not offering escape, but something else, something closer to direction. Reeves nodded slowly, the motion deliberate, not out of obligation but understanding, and he rose from the chair with controlled movement, the weight still present but no longer shifting unpredictably, as if it had found its place. He turned toward the door, pausing briefly before opening it, not from hesitation, but from awareness. And when he stepped back into the hallway, the light seemed sharper, the air cooler, the world outside the office more defined. Downstairs, the precinct continued its steady rhythm, but now the current beneath it was clearer, conversations quieter, glances more direct, and as Reeves moved through the space, there was no attempt to avoid him, no confrontation, just acknowledgement, subtle and present, carried in the way people allowed him to pass without interruption. Outside, the sky had shifted toward midday, the light stronger now, casting fewer shadows, revealing more than it concealed. And across the city the video continued its quiet spread, no longer just a clip, but a point of reference, something people returned to, replayed, paused, examined. In her home, Naomi sat once more at the table, the sunlight now reaching fully across the surface, warming the wood beneath her hands, and she allowed herself a moment to be still, not because she needed to recover, but because she understood the value of stillness, the way it clarified everything that followed. Her phone rested nearby, the stream of notifications slowing slightly, not because the moment had faded, but because it had settled into a different phase, one that required response rather than reaction. She reached for it again, scrolling this time with intention, opening a message from a familiar name, a colleague who did not waste words, and she read it once, then again, her expression unchanged but her focus sharper, and after a brief pause, she typed a response, her movements precise, controlled, the message short, clear, and final, across the street. Marcus sat with his elbows on the table, his chin resting lightly on his hands as he watched the numbers continue to rise. But his attention had shifted from the screen to the memory of the moment itself, the way she had stood, the way she had spoken, the calm that did not match what he expected, and he found himself replaying. Not just the video, but the feeling of it, the quiet certainty that had filled the space. "Mom," he said softly, without looking up. She was not scared, and his mother paused, considering the words. "No," she replied. She was not. And there was something in her tone that suggested understanding beyond the moment, something deeper, something learned. Back at the precinct, Reeves stepped outside, the door closing behind him with a soft, final sound, and for a moment he stood there, the air moving around him, the sounds of the city returning in full, not filtered, not distant, just present, and he inhaled slowly, the breath grounding him in a way that the walls inside could not. His phone vibrated. Again, and this time he took it out, looking at the screen directly. The video opened once more, but now he watched it differently, not as something happening to him, but as something he was part of, something that would remain long after the moment itself had passed. He did not look away this time. He let it play fully, the beginning, the middle, the end, and when it finished, he exhaled again, quieter, steadier, as if accepting not just what had happened, but what it meant inside her home. Naomi set her phone down once more and stood, moving toward the door, not to return to the scene, but to step into the next part of it, whatever that would be, her posture unchanged, her pace steady, her presence grounded in something that did not shift with attention or noise. Outside, the light held steady, the day continuing without pause. But beneath it all, the balance had already changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that carried forward, shaping what would come next in ways that did not need to be announced to be understood. The front door opened again, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with a quiet intention that carried more weight than any raised voice could have, and Naomi stepped outside into the midday light, the sun now high enough to remove the softness from the shadows, leaving everything clear, defined, impossible to misread. The street looked almost the same trimmed lawns, the same parked cars, the same calm order, but the stillness held something new, something that had settled into the space and refused to leave. Across the street, Marcus noticed her immediately, his posture straightening as he stood from the table and moved closer to the window, his phone still in his hand, the screen dim now, but warm, as if it had absorbed the moment itself. Naomi did not look toward him right away, her gaze moving slowly across the street, not searching, not reacting, simply acknowledging the space, the place where everything had shifted. Her hands rested loosely at her sides, the faint mark on her wrist still visible but no longer sharp, just a reminder, not of pain, but of clarity. A car passed slowly at the end of the block, the driver glancing over, recognizing something without fully understanding it, and the motion continued, the world moving forward as it always did, even when something beneath it had changed. Naomi stepped down from the porch, her feet finding the same path across the grass, the impressions from earlier now gone, the surface smooth again, as if nothing had ever disturbed it, and yet the memory of those steps remained, carried not in the ground, but in the people who had seen them. She stopped, near the edge of the yard, her posture steady, her gaze lifting slightly as she looked down the street, the distance stretching out in front of her, open, unchanged, and for a moment she simply stood there, not as someone returning to a scene, but as someone closing it. The air moved gently around her, the faint rustle of leaves breaking the silence just enough to remind the world that it was still turning, still continuing. And she inhaled slowly, the breath grounding her, not because she needed it, but because it marked the moment, a quiet acknowledgement that what had happened was complete. Across town, Officer Reeves stood near the edge of the precinct lot, the city moving around him in steady motion, the sound of traffic rising and falling, and he looked down at his phone once more, the video still open, the numbers higher now, the comments longer, the reactions more defined, and for the first time, he did not focus on the numbers, he focused on the frame itself, the stillness, the way she had stood, the way he had spoken, the difference between what he thought he saw and what was actually there. His thumb hovered over the screen, then moved, not to close it, not to scroll, but to pause it on a single moment. The same moment the senior officer had pointed to earlier, the place where everything could have gone differently. And he held it there, not avoiding it, not rushing past it, just allowing it to exist exactly as it was. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and lowered the phone, his posture shifting slightly, not lighter, but clearer, as if something inside him had settled into place, not resolved, but understood. Back on the quiet street, Naomi turned her head. Slightly, her gaze now landing on Marcus, who stood watching from across the way, his expression open, curious, carrying something more than just observation. She held his gaze for a brief second, not long, not intense, just enough to acknowledge him, to recognize the role he had played without saying a word, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Marcus blinked, surprised, then nodded back, the motion quick but certain, as if something had passed between them that did not need explanation. Naomi turned again, her attention moving forward, and she walked back toward the house, not hurried, not delayed, her steps even, her presence unchanged, and when she reached the door, she paused for just a second, her hand resting lightly on the handle before opening it and stepping inside once more. The door closed softly behind her, the sound quiet, final, and the street returned to its stillness. But not the same stillness as before, this one carrying something deeper, something that would remain long after the moment itself had passed. Across the city, the video continued to move, not as a burst, not as noise, but as a steady current, reaching people who would watch it, pause it, think about it, and carry it with them in ways that would shape how they saw the next moment, the next decision, the next choice. And in that quiet movement, in that steady spread, the balance that had shifted on a small piece of grass continued to hold, not because it was forced, not because it was loud, but because it was true, and truth, once seen clearly, does not need to announce itself to remain. The house grew quiet again after the door closed, not empty but settled, the kind of quiet that carries completion rather than absence. And Naomi stood just inside the entryway for a moment, her hand still resting lightly against the wood, as if feeling the finality of it, the boundary between what had happened outside and what remained within. The light filtered through the windows at a softer angle now, no longer sharp, no longer demanding, just present. And she moved forward with the same steady pace she had carried through the entire day, her footsteps quiet against the floor, her posture unchanged, grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. On the table, her phone rested where she had left it, the screen now still, the flood of notifications slowed to a manageable rhythm, no longer urgent, no longer overwhelming, just part of the aftermath, and she did not reach for it immediately. She let it sit, allowed the silence around it to exist without interruption. Outside, the neighborhood had fully returned to its routine, doors opening and closing, distant, conversations rising and falling, the ordinary reclaiming its place on the surface, but beneath it, something remained, something subtle but permanent, carried in the way people looked at the same street with slightly different eyes. Across town, Officer Reeves stood alone for a moment longer before finally moving, his steps slower but more certain, as if each one now carried intention rather than habit, and he walked back toward the building, not to escape the moment, but to face what followed. The weight no longer something he resisted, but something he accepted. Inside the precinct, the screens continued to display the video, the narrative forming, the details examined. But for him, the noise had quieted, not because it had stopped, but because he had stopped trying to outrun it. And as he moved through the hallway, the glances he received were no longer distractions, they were acknowledgments, markers of a moment that had already taken shape. In her home, Naomi finally stepped toward the table, her fingers brushing the edge of the phone before picking it up, and she unlocked it with a calm, deliberate motion, scanning the messages one more time, not for validation, not for reaction, but for clarity. And when she found what she needed, she typed a single response, brief, precise, and set the phone back down again. The clock on the wall continued its steady ticking, marking time in small, even increments, and she turned toward the hallway, moving deeper into the house, leaving the table, the phone, the moment itself behind her, not because it no longer mattered, but because it had already done what it needed to do. Across the street, Marcus stood by the window once more, his phone now resting on the table, the screen dark, but his mind still replaying the scene, not as a video, but as a feeling, the stillness, the calm, the way she had stood without raising her voice, without needing to prove anything. And he leaned his forehead lightly against the glass, his breath fogging a small circle that faded almost immediately. She changed him, he said quietly, not looking back, and his mother paused, considering the words before answering. Maybe, she said softly, or maybe she showed him something he had never seen before. And Marcus nodded, the distinction settling into his understanding in a way that would stay with him longer than the video ever could. Outside, the light began to soften again as the afternoon stretched toward evening, the shadows returning slowly, lengthening across the grass, the same grass that had held the moment earlier now smooth, undisturbed, offering no visible trace of what had taken place. But the absence of marks did not mean the absence of change, and the stillness carried that truth quietly, without needing to announce it. In the precinct, Reeves paused once more near the doorway, his hand resting briefly against the frame before stepping inside, not hesitating, not resisting, just moving forward. And as the door closed behind him, the world outside continued on, the city moving, the story shifting, the moment becoming part of something larger. And in the quiet space of her home, Naomi moved through the hallway and into the deeper rooms, her presence steady, her pace unbroken. And as the light dimmed slightly behind her, the final echo of the moment settled into silence, not forgotten, not erased, but complete in the way that only truth can be, carrying forward not as noise, but as something quieter, something lasting, something that did not need to be seen again to be understood.